Hey, if you enjoyed this video, this is part of a larger course I've just released called Orchestral Mockup Fundamentals. It's for composers looking to improve their orchestral mockup chops, and it's linked in the description. So I've already covered the 4 values. Something of note is, I have a fader that has these 4 different values here, which is really helpful. You don't need that. You could just have one fader or even a mod wheel, which is sometimes what people have with their keyboard. But the important thing, the most important thing, is knowing actually how your fader feels and being able to perform it appropriately. Now let's get into talking about performing these different instruments. It's really, really useful to note the actual shape of your phrase because that's going to influence how you actually perform this. Typically, we're going to have our modulation kind of reflect that. So if we go over to a flute, right, I would probably play this like this and take note of my hand. So first of all, I actually rode up and down. At the beginning of the phrase, I tend to have a little lift in, and at the end of the phrase, I tend to have a little dip out. If we look at the way I program that, you can see it's exactly that. I'm trying not to have too many jumps and bumps for a phrase like this because I want it to feel very fluid and legato. The less that I'm bumping that fader, the less I'm getting that kind of stagger phrase or kind of pointed phrase-like thing, pa, 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 pa. I don't want that for this kind of a phrase. Now, let's say we wanted a little bit more expression. Now we could use something like expression to be able to control this even more. And I would typically use it at the beginnings and the ends. So let's see how that would look. A lot more subtle, right? Because we've already got modulation doing most of the work here. So the expression is just fine-tuning the idea. So in, slight dip for almost like a breath, and then out. Now you'll notice that I recorded this in passes. That's a really useful way to do it. It's really difficult to perform this all at once. If I go to record things live, which most people see on my YouTube videos, what I'm typically doing is the performance of the pitches and then modulation. That tends to be just about it. It's too difficult for me to do more than that, unless I'm using the breath controller, which we'll get into a little bit later. Now let's do the same thing for brass. Brass is going to have a bit more of that kind of pushy entrances. So we'll have things like this. So we have pa, pa. If we didn't do that, it would sound like this. Just a legato sound. And in terms of the actual keyboard, what I'm doing, I'm actually letting go of the notes a little bit. Giving time for that note to decay. Dum, bum, bum. Notice it's a lot more kind of pushing. So I'm actually having bum, 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 less fluid, right? You can obviously use things like expression, and expression is very useful for brass because we might have it sounding loud, but we want it to be a little bit less brassy. So that's where it can be super handy to use expression. Right? But let's say this part is too loud. We can use expression to control that a bit. So we could do something like this. So check out what I'm doing with my hand there. Bringing up expression first. So expression is up, and now I can bring up modulation. Right? Without that, it would just be this. I don't have control. Right? Now let's get into the strings a little bit. Strings, particularly good for faders. Not so good for breath controllers because strings draw long lines typically. So they don't have that kind of pa-pa thing that the brass or even the winds might have. They tend to be a bit more fluid. Kind of want to do long arcing lines. Not much movement here. It's just these kind of arcing lines. Sometimes I will even go and use a pencil tool and just draw over those, which I like to do because you get a bit more fluidity. Now, if you're using something a bit more articulated, you might want to use just a different patch instead of trying to change the way that you're programming. Because a lot of this is a matter of which patch you're using, but also how you're programming it, and kind of a combination between the two. Now, if we're talking about percussion, these faders are mostly irrelevant except for two things. Number one is going to be the modulation for rolls. So for rolling something like a timpani, that's obviously very important to use modulation. But the other thing for me, I tend to either use volume if the library doesn't support expression, or expression as the default. And that's really useful because just like the brass, you get some control over how you're actually having this phrase crescendo. So if I was just trying to use mod wheel for a timpani roll, it's pretty good. But what if I wanted it to kind of swell in a little bit more? Well, now I could use volume like this. Right? Also really useful for things like suspended cymbal. If I just use the modulation, I would get this. Hear the lowest value. And it comes in so quickly. So what I typically will do is something like this. This is my volume, and this is the modulation. Modulation, just like the brass, it kind of ramps up closest near the end, whereas the volume is a bit more consistent. So I'm really just saving those top values for the very end. If you enjoyed that video, definitely recommend you check out Orchestral Mockup Fundamentals. It's linked in the description, and I'm running a pre-sale right now from now until September 2nd when the course goes live. Thanks for watching, leave a like, see you in the next video.